So welcome back to Read 536, Week 7. This is part 2 of our discussion. So we left off briefly describing this shift that was taking place in the 80s. I don't remember if I said it on the other slide, but um, some researchers or theorists refer to this time period as education's right turn, as in a political shift to the right in terms of education and education policy. So let's go ahead and talk about what Reagan does. All right, I'm on the wrong thing. Here we go. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So what Reagan does is he puts together brings together a commission to investigate the state of American education. So remember, he wants to abolish or not abolish the Department of Education, but what he wants to do is kind of decrease its prominence by not making it or having it not be a cabinet post. So he brings together a commission to investigate kind of the state of American education, and there is some dispute about why. So some say that Reagan and his administration expected the results of this report, or the report, A Nation at Risk, that the Commission will publish. They expected the results of this report to be better than people thought the state of education to be, and that they could then use this report to prove that there was little need for federal involvement in education. Some say that they wanted this report to show that the state of American education was so poor and that the federal government then wasn't doing a good job, so then that would support their idea that you didn't need the federal government at such a high level department or post involved in education because they weren't doing a good job. And others say that, including the commission itself, that it was just this response to the obvious academic decay of American schooling. But in any case, this commission was created, and it consisted of 18 different members. They were from the private sector, from the field of education, and from government. And they said that they, in their kind of front matter, that their charter, that they were responding to the observation that the United States educational system was failing to meet the need, or the national need, for a competitive workforce. So, we've heard this idea before, and we'll hear it again later. But what's interesting is that there's some really colorful language associated with the report, with the commission's report when they publish it. And it opens up with quotes such as, "The educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and as a people." That phrase, "rising tide of mediocrity," becomes quite a rallying cry during this time. They also have a popular or kind of a famous statement that says, "If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war." So obviously some very colorful language intended to grab attention. But what did the report itself say? So it summarized its findings into 4 broad categories: content of schooling, expectations, time, and teaching. And so this is what they came out with. So just 1/3 of 17-year-olds could solve a math problem that required several steps. About 40% of 17-year-olds tested could not successfully draw inferences from written material. Only a fifth of students could write a decent persuasive essay. That SAT scores had dropped over 50 points in the verbal category and about 40 points in the math category. They talked about this idea of minimum competencies, that we were really only requiring students to meet these very bare minimums, and that with these they were guaranteed college admissions, and they were only doing what was required to meet um, these college admissions. That overall less time was being spent on academics. This time can be kind of where we get the jokes about taking basket weaving and those types. So the idea of it was kind of like a more liberal arts focus, I would say, in schools at the time, like not as rigorous with the core in terms of math and science and history. It was there was their electives were being brought into the act, and so kind of less of a classical academic core and more of a liberal arts type study going on in schools. Um, the report said that teachers came from the bottom 25% of all college graduates, and that teacher education programs were too general, and that many teachers were unqualified to teach the subjects that they were teaching. And then they talked a little bit about teacher salaries and how teacher salaries were low, and overall the influence that teachers have was pretty minimal, and that millions of adults were illiterate. So this is, this is what the report told us. And so let's think about, or let's talk about what its influence on curriculum or on reading was. So what's kind of funny or ironic is that this report unexpectedly really resonated with people. So as I said, there was kind of this tide of change coming culturally in the United States, and so kind of a backlash in some respects to what had been going on in the late 1960s and the 70s. I think there was this idea that the youth wasn't serious. The way that people looked, the way that people dressed, the way that people spoke was very kind of relaxed and just not reflective, I think, of the idea of that people had in their head of what America was, should be, could be, or should be heading. And so this report kind of was like, see, we told you. This is the public actually really embraced the results of this report, or the finding of this report. And so there's some stories that Reagan expected the report to say something else, and he was going to address it in his State of the Union speech, and he got the result, or he got the findings that day or the day before, and then he wasn't going to mention it at all because he didn't like what the report said. So it's kind of some interesting backstory if you dig into it. But ultimately what happened is he really had to back off his plans for cutting federal spending on education. Kind of big scale if you look at what he wanted to do in terms of setting up voucher systems and really getting the federal government out of education. It ends up being exactly the opposite. So today, really a tiny number of students attend private schools or charters are actually publicly funded, but attend them through a voucher system. And K-12 spending has grown from 16 billion in 1980 to over 100 billion in 2013. I don't know what those dollars are adjusted for inflation, but whatever the Reagan administration's intentions were, if they did actually intend to reduce the federal government's role in education, they did exactly the opposite. So they expanded it as it had really never been expanded before since Lyndon Johnson passed ESEA, and then it would continue probably to just be expanded over the next about 20 years or so into the era of accountability. So Nation at Risk, it puts education on the national stage. So it had started to get there in the late 1970s in the discussions during the campaigns and the election, but it really did put the idea of education and what we needed to do about it forefront. It led, or it was the beginning of comprehensive school reform and started to pave the way for standards-based public education. It like I said, it paved the way for significantly greater federal involvement in education. And one of the things that it really did too was embed this idea of a causal relationship between student achievement and how our public schools are performing, and the national economy. So we had heard this before, but it really reinforced reinforced this idea. And you can, for evidence of that, you can look back to those quotes that they put in the opening of the commission's report. So this idea that the foundations of our society are being eroded by this rising tide of mediocrity, and that the poor state of our education, threaten our very future as a nation and as a people. So this report would really go on to be very influential in the next kind of wave of reform, the second wave of reform, as it's sometimes referred to. So again, obviously, when we're talking about academic performance and issues of schooling, we inevitably turn to reading, right? So as a response, my bullets are off. Sorry. As a response to A Nation at Risk, a report called Becoming a Nation of Readers, the report of the Commission on Reading, is published in 1985. So it was intended to address the issue of how best to teach reading. It was written to report conclusions from the research about reading. So it was this first kind of attempt to quantify best practice and wanted to be research-based, and to make recommendations about the key features of reading instruction. What's interesting is that this report is certainly not the first of its kind. We can go all the way back to Why Johnny Can't Read to talk about reports that addressed the idea of struggling readers and what we needed to do about it. But one of the differences in this report was its audiences. It was meant to disseminate information not just to teachers and to school personnel, but to give information about reading and reading instruction to more of a lay audience. So parents, school board members, policymakers, test makers, politicians, all those folks. So that, that kind of, affected kind of how it was written. But so what did it say? So this Becoming a Nation of Readers report determined that, skilled reading is constructive, right? So this is kind of the approval of whole language. It's fluent. This is where we get that word automaticity, and it starts to really gain a foothold as a very popular word in the reading world. Skilled reading is strategic, so there's this focus on comprehension, right? Because whole language, or advocates of whole language and psycholinguistics, would say that reading is about making meaning. Motivation comes into the picture, so it's important for readers to be motivated. This is where this report really is where we get the idea of silent sustained reading. So independent reading, how it ties into motivation, and wide reading, all really starts to come in to focus here as a practice. They also say that reading is a lifelong pursuit, and so that it requires continuous practice, development, and refinement. And so it takes a really tentative and cautious stand on emergent literacy, and in particular, early phonics instruction. In fact, they kind of couch the entire emergent literacy piece as what happens to students before they come into school. And so then they kind of sidestep the issue a little bit of phonics. And what it really does is it opens the gates for proponents of whole language. So I'm sure that you can probably guess that it did have significant influence on curriculum and reading instruction, but that there was also great criticism of the report. So when we come back in part 3, we will talk about this criticism.